Imagine waking up one morning, perfectly healthy. By noon, you're burning with fever. By evening, painful black swellings erupt across your body. By the next morning, you're gone. Your family, dead within the week. Your neighbors, vanished. Your entire street, silent. This wasn't a nightmare. This was reality for millions of people in the 1300s. And what makes it truly terrifying is that it happened so fast, so completely, that entire cities were erased before anyone understood what was happening. Today, we're diving into the darkest chapter of human history, the Black Death, the pandemic that killed half of Europe, destroyed civilizations, and changed the world forever. This is a story of horror, survival, and the fragility of everything we take for granted. Let's begin. Before we understand how everything fell apart, we need to see what the world looked like at its peak. Because the early 1300s weren't a time of darkness, they were actually a golden age. Europe was thriving like never before. The climate was warmer, crops were abundant, and the population had exploded. Cities that had been small towns for centuries were now bursting at the seams. Paris, Venice, Florence, London, these weren't just growing, they were booming. Massive Gothic cathedrals were rising into the sky, monuments to human ambition and faith. But here's what made this era truly special. The world was connected. Thanks to the Mongol Empire's Pax Mongolica, trade routes stretched from Europe all the way to China. A merchant in Italy could buy silk that had traveled thousands of miles without ever leaving protected trade networks. Spices, gold, ideas, technology, everything was floating across continents faster than ever before. People felt invincible. They had conquered hunger, built incredible cities, and connected the known world. They thought they were living in a new age of progress and prosperity. They had no idea they were standing on the edge of an abyss, because that same network of trade routes that brought them wealth was about to deliver death on a scale they couldn't imagine. The infrastructure for global catastrophe was perfectly in place. All it needed was a spark, and that spark was already burning thousands of miles away.
Deep in the steppes of Central Asia, in what's now Kyrgyzstan in northern China, a killer had been waiting for millennia. Not an army, not a war, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This microscopic organism had lived quietly for centuries in the burrows of marmots and ground squirrels, maintaining a delicate balance with its rodent hosts. But in the 1330s, something changed. Climate historians believe a series of droughts followed by heavy rains devastated the food supply for these rodent populations. Starving and desperate, infected rodents began migrating closer to human settlements along the Silk Road, and they brought their fleas with them. The first human infections were mysterious and terrifying. People developed raging fevers, uncontrollable vomiting, and worst of all, massive, painful swellings in their lymph nodes called buboes. These dark, grotesque lumps gave the disease its name. By the early 1340s, fragmentary reports began reaching Mediterranean ports. Merchants spoke of civilizations in the East vanishing overnight, tales of rains of fire and pestilence that left entire regions depopulated. India, Mesopotamia, the steppes, all falling silent. Europeans heard these stories with a mix of horror and detachment. These were distant lands, exotic places. Whatever was happening there couldn't possibly reach them. They were catastrophically wrong. The turning point in history happened at a fortified city called Caffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula. This wasn't just any city, it was a wealthy Genoese trading colony, the crucial link between Asian overland routes and European maritime networks. In 1346, Caffa was under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg. The siege had dragged on for months. The Genoese defenders were masters of fortification, and the Mongols couldn't break through. Then the plague arrived in the Mongol camps. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, then thousands. Their bodies turned black with gangrene. The mighty Mongol army was dissolving, not from enemy weapons, but from an invisible enemy.
Facing defeat and watching his forces crumble, Johnny Beg made a decision that would echo through history. In an act of desperation and calculated brutality, he ordered the plague-ridden corpses of his soldiers loaded onto catapults. For days, the sky over Caffa rained death. Diseased bodies smashed onto rooftops, into marketplaces, into streets. The psychological terror was overwhelming, but the biological impact was even worse. The bacteria from the corpses, carried by fluids and by fleas abandoning their cold hosts for warm living ones, infiltrated the city. The fortress that couldn't be breached by armies fell to biology. Panic consumed Caffa. The wealthy Genoese merchants realized the city was doomed, so they did what merchants do best: they ran. 12 Genoese galleys loaded with refugees, cargo, and unseen stowaways slipped out of the harbor, sailing for home. These ships were floating coffins, and they were heading straight for Europe. The fleeing ships sailed through the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, which would soon be devastated, and into the Mediterranean. This sea was Europe's economic highway, filled with busy ports in constant contact with each other. The ships became vectors of apocalypse, stopping at major ports to resupply and trade, unknowingly seeding infection at every harbor. The first European city to fall was Messina in Sicily. When the Genoese galleys arrived in October 1347, dock workers rowed out to greet them and found a scene from hell. Most sailors were dead, their bodies rotting on deck. The few survivors were delirious, covered in black boils, oozing blood and pus. The port authorities immediately ordered the ships expelled, but it was too late. The true carriers, black rats and their fleas, had already scurried down the mooring ropes onto the docks. Messina became a test case for how Europe would handle the plague, and it failed spectacularly. The infection spread with terrifying speed through the crowded medieval port city. Within weeks, the social order collapsed. People fled to the countryside, only spreading the contagion further across Sicily. News of the pestilence spread faster than the disease itself. Other ports tried to close their harbors to ships from the east, but medieval quarantine was ineffective. Greed often overcame caution, and a ship full of valuable spices could usually bribe its way into port. By early 1348, the great maritime cities were falling like dominoes. Genoa, the home port of the death ships, was devastated. Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, faced an existential crisis. The Venetians eventually developed the lazaretto system, quarantine islands where ships had to wait 40 days before entering the city. It was a brilliant public health innovation, but for the first wave, it came too late. Gondolas that once carried lovers and merchants now became funeral barges, piling bodies high as they navigated the silent canals. From Italy, the plague spread to Marseille, the gateway to France, and across the Adriatic to Dubrovnik. The coastal perimeter of Europe was breached. Now the disease turned inland, toward the densely populated heart of medieval civilization. Medieval cities were powder kegs waiting for a spark. Paris, Florence, London, Barcelona, these were walled enclosures of narrow, winding alleys and multi-story timber houses that blocked out the sun. Open sewers ran down the center of streets. People and animals lived in close quarters. Hygienically, they were disasters. When the plague hit these metropolises, it didn't just kill people, it killed the city itself as a functioning organism. And here's what made it so terrifying. Nobody understood what was happening. The best medical minds of the age, doctors from the University of Paris, were completely baffled. They didn't have germ theory. Instead, they worked with ancient Greek theories of humors and miasma. They believed the air itself had been corrupted, possibly by a planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 that released toxic vapors from the Earth. Their treatments were not just useless, they were actively harmful. Doctors advised people not to bathe because it opened pores to corrupted air. They burned aromatic woods to combat the smell of death. They bledded patients who were already weakened. They lanced the buboes, which only spread the infection faster. Every rational attempt to stop the disease only seemed to feed it. The realization that their best knowledge was powerless created a profound psychological crisis. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian writer who witnessed Florence lose perhaps 60% of its population, left us haunting accounts of the social collapse. The terror of contagion was so overwhelming that the most sacred bonds of humanity were severed. Fathers abandoned dying sons. Wives left husbands to die alone. The sick were walled up in their homes to prevent spread. The intricate machinery of medieval life ground to a halt. Laws went unenforced because there were no magistrates. Courts closed. Bakeries stopped baking. Markets emptied. The sounds of a vibrant city, carts rattling, merchants shouting, construction, music, were replaced by oppressive silence, broken only by the constant tolling of church bells announcing another death, until the bell ringers themselves died or authorities banned the bells to prevent panic. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Consecrated churchyards filled to capacity, forcing authorities to dig massive plague pits, trenches where bodies were stacked in layers, covered with thin layers of soil. The stench must have been unbearable. In some cities, as much as 90% of the population died.
In the medieval worldview, there was no separation between the physical and spiritual realms. An event of this magnitude could only mean one thing: God was punishing humanity for its sins. The Church, the bedrock of medieval society, faced an impossible crisis. People flocked to cathedrals, praying for deliverance, crowding together in processions that only spread the respiratory, pneumonic form of plague faster. When prayers failed, and priests died just as quickly as sinners, something broke in the medieval mind. A desperate, radical piety emerged. The flagellant movement swept across northern Europe. Bands of hundreds of men, dressed in identical robes, marched from town to town. Twice daily in public squares, they would strip to the waist and whip themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood in displays of extreme penance. They believed they could take the sins of the world onto their own flesh and appease God's wrath. They were a terrifying sight, spreading religious hysteria wherever they went. But as the death toll mounted and God seemed deaf to their prayers, people needed a tangible enemy, a scapegoat, and they found one in the Jewish communities. A horrific conspiracy theory took root, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire, that Jews were poisoning Christian wells to wipe out the faithful. Despite Pope Clement VI condemning these theories and pointing out that Jews were dying at the same rates as Christians, mob mentality prevailed. Fueled by centuries of anti-Semitism and desperate fear, horrific pogroms erupted. Entire Jewish communities in Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive. The Black Death unleashed not just biological horror, but humanity's darkest impulses.
While cities were epicenters of death, 90% of medieval Europe lived in the countryside, and the plague found them too. Refugees fleeing cities carried it to villages. Traveling peddlers spread it along country roads. The devastation in rural areas was slower, but perhaps more profound. Thousands of small villages were completely wiped out, their names lost to history. The manorial system, which depended on peasant labor to work the Lord's land, collapsed. Chronicles describe eerie scenes, harvests rotting in fields with no one to bring them in, herds of livestock wandering the landscape, eventually turning feral because all the shepherds were dead. Wolves, emboldened by the lack of humans, began prowling closer to surviving settlements. The carefully managed medieval landscape was being reclaimed by wilderness. By 1350, the plague had reached the northern limits of Europe, Scotland, Scandinavia, even the Norse settlements in Greenland, delivering a death blow to those colonies.
It had burned through the entire continent in less than 5 years. By 1351, the first catastrophic wave began to subside. The bacterium had simply run out of easily accessible victims. The survivors emerged into a world transformed. The death toll will never be known precisely, but historians estimate between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia and North Africa. Europe alone lost perhaps half its population. The immediate aftermath was economic chaos and severe inflation, but then something unexpected happened. The massive depopulation created a severe labor shortage. For the first time in centuries, peasants held power. Lords, desperate to have their fields worked, had to offer higher wages and better conditions. The rigid structures of serfdom began to crack and in many places shatter. The golden age of the laborer emerged from the ashes. But the psychological scars ran deep. Art became obsessed with death. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a popular motif, showing skeletons leading kings, popes, and peasants alike to the grave. Death was the ultimate equalizer. The Black Death shattered the optimism of the High Middle Ages. It proved the fragility of human civilization against nature's power. The society that rebuilt itself was more cynical, more questioning, less willing to accept authority without question. In a dark way, the plague cleared the ground for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the slow emergence of the modern world.
For centuries, the Black Death seemed like a distant medieval nightmare, ancient history, something that could never happen in our modern scientific world. But think about it. Empty streets, locked homes, fear of the air itself, overwhelmed healthcare systems, conspiracy theories running wild, scapegoating minorities. Does that really sound like ancient history, or does it sound uncomfortably familiar? The plague was a test of civilization, of our systems, our knowledge, our humanity, and history has a way of testing us again and again. We like to think we're different now, more advanced, more prepared, but are we? Or are we just as fragile as those medieval cities, connected by our own global networks, convinced of our invincibility until the moment everything falls apart? The Black Death reminds us that civilization is not a permanent state. It's something we have to actively maintain, protect, and sometimes fight for. The infrastructure we build to connect us can also destroy us. The systems we trust can fail, and when they do, we discover what we're really made of. That's the real lesson of the plague. Not that it happened, but that it could happen again. And when it does, will we be ready? If this video opened your eyes to history's darkest chapter, hit that like button and subscribe. We're exploring the events that shaped our world and the lessons they still have to teach us. Because the past isn't dead, it's not even past, and the more we understand it, the better chance we have of surviving what comes next. I'll see you in the next one.